Previously I set up my basic structure for the eye, and now I'll work on the iris and the pupil. There are plenty of ways in which we could create the iris. One of the first and most obvious options will be the polyfill node. We can use the isolated geometry here for the iris, but I will not be doing that in this case. For this setup, I'm going to be using the carve node, so I'll duplicate my copy of the carve node where I'm generating the sclera. Here I'll change the cut parameters, and I'm going to keep the outside rather than the inside. The iris does have a curve which matches with the curve of the eye, although it doesn't really match the circle of the eye and is slightly flatter. I could update the topology here slightly, but the differences here will be minor. The way that I deal with the iris may change depending on the final type of character, as I could still add a lot of detail here, and that could be done procedurally. It could be done manually in an application like ZBrush, or it could be done with materials, for example using something like texturing XYZ. This will give me the main body of the iris, and I'll need to specify the pupil as well. For this I'm going to use a knife node. I'll duplicate the knife node which I'm using for the sclera. This will be connected to the carve. I can then raise the carve in Y, and this will create the gap for the pupil. I can then duplicate the revolve node, and I'll revolve my iris in the same way as the sclera. This will give me the geometry for the iris and the pupil, and I can use the knife to dilate the pupil. The iris, however, is a little bit blocky, and I do want to give it a little bit more detail, so I'll add a resample node before the revolve node. I'll set this to use a maximum number of segments. I will change this to have about 4 segments. I can then extrude the iris, and I'll extrude this towards the center of the eye. A forward extrusion here could cause interpenetration with the eye. I do want to retain all sides of the eye for the moment, so I will set this to output the back. And this should give me a basic iris to work with, but I do not actually want one iris, instead I want 2. So I'm going to duplicate the iris setup from after the carve node, and with this branch I'm going to manipulate the knife node. We can use this to create blend shapes for the dilation of the iris. So in this case, I'm going to raise the knife a lot, so that I create a very small iris with a very large pupil. You usually will not see the iris open this much, as this is usually the result of using muscle relaxants. In order to get the iris to open this much naturally, there will not be enough light to actually see the iris. To test these, I can get a blend shape node. I'll connect one of these to the first input, and the second will be connected to the multi-port. I'll then use the update channel names from inputs button, and this should set up a manipulatable blend shape for the iris. So this will give me a visualization for blends for these. This will work fine for within Houdini. I'll set up exportable blend shapes later. I would want to know what textures I'm working with before I do that, as there may be blending required for deformation and textures. But this will allow me to perform pupil dilation, and will give me a workable iris. The shading for the iris is incorrect, so I'll get a reverse node. I can add explicit normals to the geometry, and I can give the iris a color. I want to have a color attribute for all of the parts of the eye, so I will add a color node for the sclera as well, and the sclera will be white. All the branches for the eye should have normals added, so I'll duplicate and connect the normal node, and I'll do the same for the cornea. The cornea should be transparent, so I'll give the cornea a black color for the moment. I'm going to add a material to the cornea. This is not strictly necessary, but it will give better feedback within the viewport. I'll get a material node and I'll connect it to the branch for the cornea. I'll also need to create a material to work with. For the moment, I'll add a material network to this network. I'll enter this material network, and then I'll add a principled shader. I'll rename the shader to cornea. I'll open the parameter interface for the shader, and then I'll return to my main network. In the material node, I'll set the material. This will reference the cornea shader, and in the cornea shader, I should now be able to control the transparency. I should now have a transparent cornea within the viewport. I can set the viewport to be smooth wide, or I can remove the geometry display by setting it to smooth. I can adjust my transparency a little bit. I can also raise the specularity, as reflection is very important for the eyes, and this will give me a better impression of how the eye is actually working. There's one last thing which I can do here. I'll duplicate the color node from the branch for the cornea, and I'll connect this to the blast node which I used to create the cornea. I'll set this to be a very dark red. I'll then get a translate node which I'll place before this color node. I can shift this back slightly, and this will give us a darker background for the pupil, which should also help prevent light leaking in the back of the eye. I'll merge this with the rest of the eye. So this gives me a very basic eye to start working with. I haven't yet doubled any of the geometry for the form on the outside of the eye. I'm also not yet adding any materials or proper detailing, but this should be enough to start on a basic character setup. It will work with simplified characters, and if I need a more cinematic eye setup, I can extend this. There are also a number of things which we will still want to set up, which will apply for both game characters and film characters. For example, we will want to set up a meniscus, especially for the lower part of the eye, although there is actually a meniscus wherever the eye contacts with the eyelid. I will also want to set up a base caruncle to work with. There will also be the limbal ring. We would want to model this specifically for cinematic rigs, although from further away we can get away with that being part of the iris color. So this will give me my basic eye setup for the moment, and I should be able to use this in the layout of characters. So this is something which I can work with, and next I'm going to start packaging this up so it is a little bit more easy to work with.